Roses are red, violets are blue. That is not the kind of poetry I do. Thank you, Paul. He asked me if I was going to do that. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. Poetry is an unusual thing. I know you've probably all had to study it in school at some point. But over time, things shift, things change. And for me, poetry is largely storytelling. I started out being a fiction writer. I wrote some essays for the Detroit Free Press Sunday magazine. I did a series on Amtrak and other publications. But over time, as I was teaching, I did not have time to write many short stories, send them out, wait for them to come back, etc. But I always have so many thoughts going through my head, through my heart, some of them smacking me upside the head, and I can't let them go. So every night, right before bedtime, I write 2 or 3 poems. These days, I write them on my cell phone, flat on my back in bed, and I can tell I've fallen asleep when the cell phone hits me in the face. I love hyperbole. My students used to call it hyperbole. One summer, I got a phone call. It was from 10 of my former students. They said, "We are calling to tell you we just went to our 10th high school reunion. And we're calling you to tell you that you were the teacher we loved to hate." They said, "Now we want you to know that we are grateful that you always expected us to give our very best." I probably cried. They were wonderful students. So working for Detroit Public Schools was one of the best things that ever happened to me. When I got to Henry Ford High School in 1973, I thought I had died and gone to heaven because there were 25 English teachers in the English department. And we shared books, we shared ideas, we shared lesson plans. It was living in heaven. And because of that, I grew as a poet and as a teacher, and I will be forever grateful to my colleagues and my students. And I'm very grateful for you for being here today. This is my friend Pat. She's going to be my tech today. We have been friends for 50 years. We met at church camp. Our kids grew up together on the same street in Detroit, and we've been friends ever since. We were both wives to Lutheran ministers. In a lot of ways, poetry is like architecture. You're building words, you're building ideas, and sometimes I don't know how they'll end. One of the poems I'm going to read today, I've been carrying in my heart for 30 years, but only this year was I able to write the ending. So anyway, in my DNA, I have storytelling blood. So did my granddad, but there's a story there for later. Okay. So, Diane asked me if I would talk about why, when, and how I learned to write poetry. On your table, there are pens and scrap pieces of paper, sticky notes, and poetry prompts, if you care. You may take notes during my presentation. I won't feel offended if you're not looking at me. But I'm hoping some things will give you some ideas to fly into your head today that you might be able to write at the end of this session a haiku, and more about that in a few minutes. I was an early reader. I could read at age 4. I was very nearsighted. We didn't know it yet. My favorite aunt, a registered nurse, gave me a copy of Grimm's fairy tales, and as a joke, now remember, I'm 4, I could read all those fairy tales. I was immersed in those stories. I became Little Red. I became Snow White. Those dwarves were my friends. I became the little match girl. I knew them all. I read them backwards and forwards, and I immersed myself in them because I could only see up close. However, I always had an imagination. And my mother was always saying to me, Alinda, stop letting your imagination run overtime. But my teachers, even my Sunday school teachers, said, use your imagination. And I guess I did. And I'm most fortunate that I have the gift. And it turns out my granddad was also a storyteller. Okay, we're going to examine a few poems today, things that I have written. You will have a chance to ask questions. And then before you leave today, perhaps write your own poem to share with the people at your table or with the rest of the group if you so desire. But we're ready to begin today. We live in Michigan. I know you all know about ice. You know it's treacherous. 3 days ago, a 17-year-old slipped and fell into the Detroit River, and the rescue squad got there too late. Last month, a mother and her daughter's car flew into Lake Michigan on black ice. They're gone now. The month before that, on Lake Huron, 2 guys on a snowmobile went through the ice, and a helicopter got them both out. On my street, we just until last week, we had 4 layers of ice upon ice upon ice upon ice. I had to walk my dog on it because we don't have sidewalks, and our street didn't get plowed. It was a little bit treacherous. So I'm going to open with one of my favorite poems because I had fun writing it. And after I recite it for you, you can ask me questions. I'll give you 1 question per person, and I'll take the first 3 questions, only in interest of time. But I had so much fun writing it. Here we go. Thin ice. Skidding out across Lake Huron in Jimmy Chrysler's 69 Dodge, I learned the easy way, how to say no to boys. And so I imagined to men twice my age, and how the word maybe could be worthy enough of itself. On dark January afternoons, we fishtailed around bell buoys and channel markers. Jimmy slipping his cool white hands up under my shirt, while the snow arcing up from behind the wheels circled that car like a can-can dancer's skirt. In February, Jimmy told me it was my turn to take the wheel. And so I attempted triple salchows and side wheel figure 8s. And when the needle quivered up around 80, I began to think seriously about saying yes. But then Jimmy told me he was already married. And before I knew what was happening, his wife told me all of this had been my fault, but she intended to have him back. And then it was March, the month of rudeness, when the wind wants only to hear itself talk. And the ice breaking up on the river brought everything to a halt. Raise your hand if you have a question. Kitty. Oh, Nancy.
Is that a true story?
Bless you, bless you. That's exactly the question I wanted. Kitty.
You're not going to answer yes.
I saw your hand.
I was going to say, now, Linda, is that really true? So we have the same idea.
I'm so glad you asked. There is a sheet of paper on your table called Truth in Poetry, and famous quotes by very famous writers about the nature of truth in poetry. So I'm going to respond with a question to your question. Is the Bible true? Is the story of Jonah and the whale true? What about Salome? What about John the Baptist having his head on a platter? What about Daniel in the lion's den? I read all those Bible stories. I love them. I disappeared into that children's book of Bible stories when I was a kid, as well as the fairy tales. However, I learned from my professors that a really good poem has a nugget of truth. And it's often up to the reader to bring his or her own experience. It's not necessarily the moral of the story, but it's a nugget of truth. So I will answer your question by saying yes, no, yes, and no, yes, no. But there's always a backstory. And the backstory for this poem, it was this kind of Michigan day. I was on my way to meet a friend at a restaurant in Dearborn. And on my way there, I'd never been there before, so I gave myself plenty of time. On my way there was a presentation on NPR on the car radio about how Henry Ford test drove his Model A's and Model T's on the ice on the Detroit River. So that's going through my head on my way to the restaurant. And I'm thinking about that, wow, really fascinating. He was testing the thermodynamics. He was testing the braking capabilities and whatever else they were testing. I thought, wow, isn't that incredible? So I get to the restaurant and my friend is not there yet. So I go in and sit at a table where I can see the entrance and I order a cup of coffee. A half hour went by, she still wasn't there. And it was kind of like today, the weather was miserable. I began to get worried, but we didn't have cell phones yet. So after an hour went by, I finished my sandwich and probably a bowl of soup, and I decided I would go home. But while I was there, that whole Henry Ford thing was going through my head. So on a napkin, I wrote down the opening lines to this, skidding out across Lake Huron. I think at first, the first draft of the poem had me in a Ford, but I didn't like the way that sounded. And then when Jimmy entered the poem, I said to myself, oh, he's kind of a dodgy guy. Let's put him in a Dodge. And if you know the high school ha-ha laugh about what 69 means in case of sex education, that's how that got put in there. Hey, what can I say? I'm glad you enjoyed it, and thank you for asking. And you might want to read that little paper about truth in poetry on your way out. Okay, next. The other thing our professors always said, tease the reader to please the reader, if you have to, if you want your poem to be a success. We did the backstory, the nugget of truth. And as somebody in there says, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. Next. Okay, my mom's branding iron philosophy was, stop letting your imagination run away with you. So I would feel guilty every time she said that. I feel I was being bad because she was harsh. We were the baby boomers. There were 20 kids in the neighborhood. Every morning we spent playing sandlot baseball. We had enough for 2 teams. After we finished a hot, hearty game of baseball, then we cooled off in the sandbox and regaled each other by telling tall tales. Then we took a vote, and the person who got the most votes for the best tall tale got to be first on Jimmy Dodd's rope swing. And everybody took turns pushing the person on the rope swing. After that adventure, we threw a blanket, an army blanket, over the clothesline, made a tent, crawled inside, and read comic books all afternoon. And we had stacks of comic books because one of the boys' dads owned a pharmacy, and they sold comic books. And if the comic books didn't sell, they just cut the title off the top. Terry and Larry got to have all these comic books, and every afternoon we'd be in that hot army blanket tent reading comic books. Little Lulu, Donald Duck, Uncle Scrooge, you name it, Mickey Mouse. But along came first grade, and one day I was walking home from school. I was pretty much by myself, but there were other kids behind me. And I heard a little sing-song chant, and it went something like this. Knit, 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 knit. We know something you don't know, but we can't tell you.
Of course.
I didn't know they were talking about me. I turned around to see who they were talking about. I said, who are you talking about? They said, we're talking about you. And they sang it again. And I thought, why are they doing this? They said, why can't you tell me? Tell me. There's always somebody in a group whose mouth will flap. So one girl said to me, we're not supposed to tell you this, but your mom and dad aren't your real mom and dad. So what do you mean? What does that mean? They said, you were adopted. You were a bastard. Your real mom didn't want you. She gave you away. I was shocked. I was total disarray. And so from there, I ran home. I ran the rest of the way home. But with the feeling that there were these iron bars dropping from heaven around me like a cage. I could hardly move my feet. I get in the front door, and my mom takes one look at my face and says, what's the matter? I said, are you my real mom? Am I adopted? And she said, I don't know. We'll have to talk to your father. So I figured, okay, Dad comes home for dinner, we'll talk. No talk. The next day came and went, no talk. The following day came and went, and I said, I had to force the situation. I said, am I adopted or not? So she sat me down, and I got this lovely little story about how I was such a cute little baby, and she couldn't have babies, and so they went to the hospital, and they chose me, and took me home. The problem is, she was abusive.
She what?
She was abusive.
Oh.
She was verbally and physically abusive. At one point, she dislocated my shoulder. She used to shake me. You know what that leads to. And make me stop using my imagination. I was totally floored. But anyway, I mean, I was a kid. You know, I had life at school, I had some friends, but from that point on, I began to separate myself from the people I thought had been my friends. When I didn't get invited to everybody's birthday parties, and every kid in the class got invited to the birthday parties except me and the Jewish girl who lived on the other side of town. I finally asked one little kid, I said, why didn't I get invited to your birthday party? You got invited to mine. And he said, my mom said, because you're adopted. Well, okay, that was the thinking at the time.
Yeah.
And Kate Thorson, I love you for your work, and we've talked about this. But Pat, my best friend, was an adoptive mom, and she was wonderful at it. But this came after the time of the 1950s adoptions. Nobody would ever tell me a single thing about my adoption. I didn't know what my name was. I didn't know if I had brothers and sisters. I didn't know who my family was. However, my adoptive grandmother had gone to the adoption with my mom. My dad was still in the army in Germany. And she overheard tidbits of the conversation between the social workers. She was the only person who would ever talk to me about my adoption and how I felt. But she knew how I felt because her mother had died in childbirth. She never knew her mom. So she understood where I was coming from. She had 2 or 3 small details. She said, I think I heard them say that your family were piano teachers, that your name on your original birth certificate was Karen, and that your last name may have been Beals or Ball, but I don't know. That's all the information she had. As I grew, I joined all of the adult adoptee justice groups who fought up through the 90s to open records to adult adoptees. And this was an Ohio adoption. I started going at age 21. I went in person to the probate judge every year for 30 years. I was 55 when I got a phone call one morning. I didn't recognize the person at the other end. He said, hello, you don't know me, but I saw your name on the Ohio adoptees, adult adoptees site, not site. He said, but I think I can help you find your family. And I thought, what? What? Is this a ruse? Is this fakery? He said, I said, and what are you going to charge me? And he said, no fee. And I thought, yeah, there's a sucker born every minute. He said, I can find your family. I know I can, but I want to know if I have your permission. I said, well, I guess so. So he said, I'll get back to you. 2 weeks went by, 2 months, 6 months. I thought, okay, I was the sucker. One day the phone rang. He said, I'm here to tell you that I have found your sister. She's willing to talk to you. Now, I was 55 at the time.
Oh my gosh.
Your family is in Nussens. It still lives in Columbus, Ohio. I can put you together if you wish to do so. Part of them are willing to meet you. Some of them met me with open arms. It was wonderful. The others said, no way. I'm sure they thought I was after their money. How he got that information, he was a retired state police officer. He had access to all Ohio public traffic records, car registrations, etc. There's so much DNA going on, but anyway, I went to meet my sister. I flew down to Miami, where she was a nurse at Miami-Dade. When we arrived at the airport, we were each wearing a green and white striped shirt. We had on faded blue jeans.
Oh my gosh.
We were wearing glasses. I said, why don't I take you to dinner? She said, no, I'll cook tonight. You come to my house for dinner. So I said, okay, I'll take you for lunch tomorrow. So we go to her house, and I said, I'll set the table. She said, well, the dishes are over there. Please excuse them. They're mismatched, but I can only afford to buy one at a time. So I go over, get the dishes out, and I'm, holy socks. This is the same pattern I have, but I can only afford to buy one at a time. Okay. She said, well, my 2 sons are going to join us for dinner. She had 3 sons, but only 2 were there. We shared details. My children's names are Eric, Lara, Jeremy. Her children's names were Eric, Laura, Jerome. So I put the plates on the table, and she said, and the silverware is over here, and I pull out the silverware. It's the same pattern. It's old, it's cheap, it's unusual, but go figure, right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, astonishing. So like the first time in my life I had a connection. She told me about her dad, who was different from my dad. I learned things about my mother, who was a flaky Betty White type ditz. I did meet her ultimately. And anyway, the sons at the dinner table, she said one of them probably will leave because he doesn't think he really wants to meet you. I said, that's fine. So in the middle of dinner, he gets up, he goes to his room, and I thought, okay, he's gone. 5 minutes later, he's back with his camera. He said, I have to get your photos. He said, you two are so much alike. It's uncanny. Even your mannerisms are similar. So for the first time, I had a connection.
Oh, wow.
I had access to some names. And as it turned out, my family ran a hardware and paint store in Columbus, Ohio, but in the back room, they taught accordion, piano, and mandolin lessons.
Oh my goodness.
I had cousins who were music professors in Ohio universities. My own kids, my legacy to my own grandkids is music lessons. I set aside $10,000 for each when I retired. They all play several instruments. I play 3. But anyway, enough about that. There was DNA. And that's when I learned that my granddad, on my dad's side of the family, was a storyteller. And he had perpetrated a hoax. And the hoax was he had met his wife, that he came from Breslau, Poland, to the United States via the Pacific Ocean, that he met his wife, my grandmother, in a bar in Colorado, that she was Native American, and that's why she didn't speak a lick of English. Well, wouldn't you know, that was the same city that my husband and his family, who were German refugees, came from to the United States in the 1950s. So we decided we're kissing cousins.
I guess.
So anyway, on with the poetry. Some of the influences that I had in terms of artists and writers. But anyway, let's just get on with the poetry here. Go ahead. One of my professors, the guy who taught us how to write haiku, and there's a sample haiku on your table, said, you can write poetry about anything you want, but in this class, I don't want anybody to write any poems about the moon. Why? Why? As he put it, there's nothing you can say or write about the moon that hasn't already been said. And I thought, try me. So for a while, I began writing haiku. Haiku has 3 lines of poetry. The first line has 5 syllables. The second line has 7 syllables. The third line has 5. I began trying to rearrange my thoughts into haiku. And at the point in which I had written maybe 50 haiku, it turned out they all had the moon in it, and my university, Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, created a poetry prize. And he encouraged me to enter, and I entered, and at the day of the awards, 3rd place went to this girl, 2nd place went to that guy, and 1st place, I think I cried.
Yeah.
And so many of the poems I have to share with you today at some points have the moon in it, and unfortunately it still shows up in my work. Next. Here's a sample. Midnight moon puzzle, snagged in the trees' top branches, waiting for the wind. And if you count them, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 and 5. Okay. Now, this is not a haiku, but it has the moon in it, and it's rather short, refraction. Like the moon on late night water, my memories of you keep breaking. First light, then shadow, and always the unbearable space that hold the two together. And that was for a dear friend of mine who had just died at about the time I wrote it. Okay.
The interesting thing about the moon is it comes from all the light comes from a reflective surface.
Right. In the first breath of morning, the jay slices the sky in two to make room for the sun's eye that blinds itself in the mirror of water. In that fire of words you spoke, before the moon drowned itself in the black sea of night, taking with it all the promises I tried to hear you say, not certain now that you really said them. There's a very long poem at the end of one of my books over there that mentions that tonight the moon, masquerading as a mylar balloon, stuck in the tree at the end of the road. And it's rather a humorous poem, so I hope that later you'll want to take a look at the books. Okay. Now, this has the moon in it. Remember, poetry as storytelling. My husband had a coworker, a colleague, who worked for the Michigan Rehab Association. But before his friend had that job, he was a repo man. If you were in arrears on your auto payments, he knew how to get into your garage at night, wire your ignition, and take your car back to the dealer. And over time, I love short stories. I write short stories. But over time, I thought about that and I thought, oh, there's a connection here between love and repossession, maybe. So I wrote this series of poems called Heart Houdini, and that book is coming out in about 6 months. Bandit, Heart Houdini, eyes like hazard lights, middle of the night repo man, come to steal my heart back. Same guy picked the lock, undid the tumbler, reset the passcode, pilfered my pearls, hacked the Hootsuite. Said he loved me, only me. All the others meant nothing. Sneaked himself past my better judgment. Let me embarrass myself in public when heads turn. The midnight wind up under my skirt. At that corner where he met me. Where I waited, neighbors peeking from behind the moon, reflected in their window curtains. Stupid street lamp. For me, it's fun. But writing for me is a way to help me find myself as well as to lose myself, depending on life's variety of situations. Okay. Okay, I saw this quote and I thought it was pertinent. Art, writing is a holy experience. It helps me to see and feel, to love and to weep and laugh with, and sometimes to even get angry with God, etc. When I was searching for my birth family, I clung to that scripture that says, "Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it will be open unto you." And I spent 50 years pounding on that door, saying, "Yahweh, let me in. Why won't you open this door?" I was so angry at God that I couldn't find my family, that I was being obstructed at all fronts. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. That's not the intent here. Because in those Bible stories, I knew all along, all my life, I was the outcast. I was the leper at the gate. I was Jonah in the whale. I was Daniel in the lion's den. Somehow I knew that in my heart. But as I grew, I came to be grateful because it gave me compassion for the outcast. And for years, I worked for peace and justice, and marched for peace and justice, and worked with the oppressed. And I'm ever so glad I had that opportunity. Okay. My dear, sweet grandmother, whose mother died in childbirth, took me to church. And there's a line or two in here that are based on an actual situation, but this is the poem I wrote for her and about her. In grateful thankfulness for giving me what few tidbits of information she had. Faith. Though she says she does not believe most of it, my grandmother kneels beside me in church each Sunday, tickling my arm with the lace on her handkerchief, the one with nickels knotted into the corner, so I will have something to put into the offering plate. I don't know when I first noticed that some of the stained glass windows are worse than my nightmares, or when I first understand that the story of King Solomon and the two mothers isn't quite right. But grandmother says not to worry, that the day they drove all the way from the farm to the courthouse through a 100-year flood to get me, praying they wouldn't be late, even the angels must have been nervous next. Still, my adoptive mom refuses to discuss it. And even though my grandfather, adoptive grandfather, likes to tell how he warmed me inside his shirt all the way back home because he loved me at first sight, I keep seeing the moon, swollen on the horizon, their only source of light. But whenever the aunts whisper in the kitchen, or the uncles whistle the sad tunes they can never remember the words to, and whenever Father Anselm gets to the part about Abraham and Sarah, I know my mom longs for miracles, believing that if only she prays hard enough, God will undo what an Ohio doctor did to her when she was a girl because he was too drunk to identify her appendix.
Oh my God.
And like her, I really want to believe. There's a chapter in the Bible which says it would be perfectly natural to want to cut Lana Saminsky's tongue in half for telling me what no one ever wanted me to know in the first place. That somewhere there's a God that can take two halves of a baby and put it together again. So everything will be perfect and everyone will be happy once again. So, the mind works with scripture in a variety of ways, but this is the poem that emerged over time from, that one main incident in my life. One of the things I've been influenced about is a series of books called Bad Girls of the Bible. Two of my very best friends are feminist theologians, and they've written books of their own, but these are rather a romp, and I was so grateful to know about Jezebel. I thought Jezebel was pretty damn cool. Oh, excuse me. I felt bad for Salome because Herod made her dance in front of all of his men. She was probably partially undressed. You never know. But there were others, and I found them fascinating. Rahab, Mary Magdalene, you never know. But I was greatly impacted by all those Bible stories. And then this series of books came along, maybe 20 years ago. They're great reading if you ever want to pursue them. Go ahead. Okay, there is a sheet of writing prompts on your table with green ink, just other suggestions about what you might want to write about later in this session. Go ahead. Okay. Both our hearts crossways. Lying crosswise on the bed, your head hanging over one edge and mine the other, the sky outside, an upside down lake, and somewhere a lawnmower imitating a motorboat. As we float here a while, as if we have soared into another world, which in a way we have, I suppose. You in the book spread open across your heart, and me thinking of those paintings in the Louvre of flying lovers. A light breeze shifting the curtains, the harsh words we said an hour ago, lifting and levitating like dust motes in slant of sun. And my husband refuses to ever read in bed. Okay. The bed is for sleeping, he said. And there is eternity. And today she tells me she will go there and buy the house back. The one I lived in when she was small. And live in it forever because the bloom of light from the street lamp outside the bedroom window spun the curtains into gold, and in the deepest hour the trains rumbled past, making the windows sing a little tune. And the footboards, the floorboards hummed as if dreams tunneled under. And we were safe there together, she in her little bed beside my big one, where we reached our hands out and held on tight until morning painted the walls so delicious a yellow you wanted to lick them. And she swears she loved the smell of moss just outside the back door that made a tiny carpet just outside the back door, though I don't remember this, where the wind chimes argued day and night, and the spruce trees whispered the kinds of secrets that made a little river inside her heart, the same river I kissed a boy in when I was her age and let him kiss me back. Of course, it's all storytelling. I wouldn't have minded kissing a boy in the river, but hey, it never happened. Go ahead. Scheherazade. At one point, I was heavily into Middle Eastern folk dancing. Wayne State University had a dance troupe. I danced with them. We performed at the riverfront festivals. We met every Friday night at Old Main. 200 foreign students teaching us their dances. All of us dancing together, holding hands. One of the men once said, when men hold hands and dance together, that's what makes a nation. So I've always admired Scheherazade telling those tales, keeping that guy awake all night so he didn't have her killed. Anyway, that time the husbands were away, who can remember where, and we rolled up the carpet and pushed the furniture back against the wall, and someone brought out finger zills from her purse. And another reached up under her blouse and whisked off her bra. And we all laughed like the girls we once were. For an entire night, we belly danced to Hachig, Kazarian, and Ramsey, and shimmied around the room until we were so hot and sweaty, I threw open the French doors to the backyard. And after we danced some more, we lay on the grass under the silver maple in full moonlight, each leaf shimmering like a silver Judas coin, and the branches dividing the sky into constellations as if from a chapter in 1001 Arabian Nights. And for a while we took turns being Scheherazade, telling each other the reasons why our own husbands might think they would have cause to have us sewn into the carpet and thrown into the Bosporus come morning. And that was how those kings who no longer liked their concubines got rid of them. Slaves rolled them in a carpet, tossed them out the window of the castle, right down into the Bosporus. Holy socks. Okay. Had things been different. This is one of my favorites. How many of you have heard of the Doobie Brothers? They had some popular songs back in the 80s. Michael McDonald sang the song, "I Keep Forgetting We're Not in Love Anymore." And the first time I heard that song, I said to my husband, "Oh, be careful. If I ever disappear, I will have run off with Michael McDonald." And he said to me, "He's not very cute." And I said, "It's not the way he looks, it's that voice." But if it hadn't been Michael McDonald, I would have run off with Irish author William Trevor, who writes the most poignant and heartfelt short stories ever about love, mostly unrequited love. He's a wizard. So if Michael didn't want me to run off with him, I would have called William. Anyway, had things been different, I might have run off with him, as was my first inclination. But there were children to consider, and my book was unfinished. And spring was in full bloom. The cottonwood spilling its seedlings, and all that cotton flying with the bad company of the willows, the fluff sticking to our eyes. And maybe, if the birch trees and alders hadn't been shedding, or the oaks filling with staminate flowers for the second time, and the grasses releasing so much pollen, we might not all have been so completely miserable. I could have just disappeared mid-morning or evening. The dog in the yard, the children in the shadows, porch lights just coming on. The 17-year cicadas ratcheting up their relentless refrains. Given the right circumstances, I suppose I might have been happier. The sunsets brighter, the days more exotic. But bring me the book again, that I might reread it. Find myself on a different page. Find him in an adjacent chapter. The corner turned over. My name still emblazoned on the flyleaf of his heart. Okay, next. This is the poem I have carried in my heart for 30 years. I was only recently able to finish it. At one time, I was the PR director for Detroit Public Schools' adult education program. We had 90,000 adult ed students enrolled throughout the city of Detroit, which had 39 high schools. There was a class in every high school. There was a class in every one of the 128 middle schools. There was a class in almost every one of the more than 200 elementary schools. We did special events in the malls. We signed people up. We hired the Flying Blue Angels to fly down the Detroit River with a flag behind that says Adult Ed, sign up today. You can. We wrote textbooks for adult ed students rather than making them learn vocabulary out of a high school textbook. We had a contract with Southwestern Publishing. If you were an adult ed student and you thought you wanted maybe to be a pharmacist assistant, we had written that textbook. If you thought you wanted to be a dental hygienist or an auto mechanic, we had the full 9 yards. Many of our students worked as butchers in the Detroit slaughterhouses. But many of our students were also teen parents who had dropped out. We had special programs for teen parents that taught parenting and provided free daycare at the same time. It was a miraculous program. We also had classes in hundreds of Detroit area churches. It was marvelous, but many of them are closed now. The churches and schools have been stripped by strippers needing metal, etc. Anyway, here we go. One day I went to the community center in Hamtramck where we taught Yemenite refugees the English language, and I overheard 2 children talking. And one little girl said to the other little girl, you know, Khaled's mom sold him for many money. Yeah, we'll finish with this one. I thought, how can that be possible? So I started to write it, but I couldn't finish until this year. And when we get near the end, you'll understand why. Loves that couldn't last. Things go missing. The year we moved 12 times because Dad was drinking up the rent money, and Saba and I played behind the community center on Conant. She told me Khaled's mother sold him for many money. And so I missed him even more, his sweet, tearful face, now that I understood. And when the Domka sisters twirled down the sidewalk in their yellow sweaters, like dandelions outside St. Florian's, we lay in the grass, staring up at the steeple that still reminds me of a dunce cap. But then we moved again, and I got lost trying to find my way home. And when dark came, I cried for my real mother, who it turned out was only a tree, an old willow down by the river, who was said to lure children, but who rocked me in her arms where the little fish swam in the cradle of the moon on the water. And when the police found me and carried me home, I tried to tell them that I wasn't missing. It was Khaled. Couldn't they please find him? But they had no idea what I was talking about. And Mom spanked me so hard, I never dared mention him again. But you can see the influence of the fairy tale here, I think, how I was greatly affected by that. The day I saw my adoptive mom drop kick the Chihuahua up against the wall with her hair trigger temper, and the streak of blood down the wall that resulted, I knew she could do the same to me. So when I was still the timid outcast, not able to speak up for myself, that's where that image came from. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention. I know we've gone over. Thank you for your patience.